From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ambassador David Satterfield. Baker Briefing tackles the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Each episode is recorded in front of a live audience at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Today's topic, the Texas power grid. To moderate today's discussion, I'm pleased to welcome my colleague, Judge Ed Emmett.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you, good to be with the audience. This month marks the 2-year anniversary of what became known as Winter Storm Uri. We started naming winter storms like we name hurricanes and other events. But it was a severe weather event, caused untold suffering. The University of Houston estimated that roughly 70% of Texans lost power and half of the state population experienced disruptions in water service. This was a major event, and it contributed to over 200 deaths across the state of Texas. And as is typical, whenever you have a natural disaster, there's always the immediate desire to point fingers and say, oh, who did something wrong? But that's not what we're here for today. The question we're really here for today is, since Winter Storm Uri exposed what has to be seen as reliability concerns in the state of Texas, where are we now? Are we ready for the next winter storm, whatever its name may be? And if we're not ready, what do we need to do to get ready? So that's what the two of you get to address today. Our guests today are Dr. Julie Cohn. She's a historian at the University of Houston and non-resident scholar here at the Baker Institute. And Dr. Peter Hartley, professor at Rice University and the Baker Institute Faculty Scholar of Energy Economics. So the two of you should know something about this, and we look forward to what you have to say. So I'm going to start with the very first question, and it's more about terminology. Not many people had heard about grids before Winter Storm Uri. What are we talking about? What is a power grid? And I'll throw that to you, Dr. Cohn.
Thank you, Judge Emmett. The term the grid was first coined for the transmission network in England at the turn of the last century by an English utility owner, and really didn't come into common use in the United States until after the 1965 Northeast blackout. And there were these great quotes from people saying, I didn't even know we had a grid, or what's a grid? Is it something like the skin of a cantaloupe? Or why are we connected to people in Canada? I've never even been to Canada. So the idea of the grid really came into sort of common usage after that big outage event that brought our transmission network to the attention of people who otherwise didn't pay any attention to it. And I think it's helpful to think about what a power system is. There are three major components. There are the generators, there are the transmission lines, which are the great big power lines you see along a highway, and then there's the distribution system, which are the power lines that bring electricity to our homes and buildings like this one. Some people call the grid just the generators and the transmission lines for purposes of their engineering and operating thinking. Others think of the entire system, from the generator to the meter at your house, as the grid. And I think that's really useful for our discussion today, because in our country we have three grids: an eastern interconnection, which is everything from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean, a western interconnection, everything from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, and then we have our own, the Texas interconnection. And all three of these systems use alternating current. For any of you who are not familiar with the terms, direct current means that the electrons go in one direction, say from your battery to the thing using the battery, and alternating current means the electrons are going back and forth really fast. In our country, 60 times per second, which is what we call 60 hertz. And on a grid, everything has to operate in perfect synchrony at 60 hertz. In Texas, our grid is a system operating at 60 hertz in more or less perfect synchrony that provides electricity to 90% of the power customers in the state. It does not extend in that synchronous way beyond the boundaries of the state, and it's operated by an entity called the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. So some people call it the Texas grid, some people call it the ERCOT grid, or we could just call it the grid.
There are sort of direct current interconnections with other grids, but they're what you call asynchronous. So just to follow up what Julie was saying, that everything on the one grid has to cycle the same, but what a neighbouring grid, that also cycles at 60 hertz, but they aren't synchronized. So any power that's transmitted between is done with direct current. So you convert the AC in one grid to direct current, goes to the other grid, and it's converted back to AC at their frequency of oscillation.
We had ice Power went out in West University, where I live. We have a cabin in East Texas, and I was really worried about the cabin. So I braved the ice and the storm, and I drove the farm to market road to my cabin and got there to discover it never lost power. It wasn't part of ERCOT. It was part of something called MISO. Can you explain, because you said there were 3 major grids, but MISO's not one of those. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I get asked a lot, well, gee, I didn't lose power. What's all the fuss about?
Within the Eastern Interconnection, there are smaller subsystems. One is MISO, which stands for the Mid-Continent Interconnected System Operation. The Southwest Power Pool, which is Oklahoma, points north of there, points west. The Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland Connection, PJM. Each of those subsystems maintains its own frequency and balances load and demand within its system, but also shares power in alternating current with its next door neighbor. So within the Eastern Interconnection, there are several systems like MISO. People in Oklahoma, Louisiana, points north were just as cold and miserable as we were, if not colder and more miserable, but they were able to import enough power during those winter storms that we refer to as Uri, so that in those systems, the power outages were controlled outages. They were more localized and they didn't last as long. And the area where you were, luckily, was not one of the areas that experienced that kind of power outage.
And they did import a lot from PJM, actually.
Yeah, from the East Coast.
MISO.
Dr. Hartley, let's go back 2 years. Power outages lasted for days and days. A lot of people said it showed we have an unreliable system. What actually happened?
There's a couple of things here. There had been a similar incident in 2011, and there had been some recommendations for how to respond to that, which hadn't actually been adequately followed up, some of them, and I'll get back to that. But in this event, it was worse than 2011, but in the interim, other changes have been made to the ERCOT system that made it worse. So one is, our system actually is engineered primarily to handle summer peaks. And the summer peaks tend to be pretty short in duration, and they satisfy air conditioning load, which tends to be much more peaky. And so as a result, we have things like you can sign contracts with some customers, particularly industrial users, to cut them off if there's a shortage or we're tight for a supply. But those contracts are designed really for summer situations where the peak is a very short number of hours. The problem with the winter peak was it was extended, and so we didn't have the same kind of capability there. Another thing that's happened is in the interim we've had a lot more people putting in reverse cycle air conditioning and heating systems rather than relying on natural gas. So a lot more houses in Texas rely on electricity for heating services. So that's made winter demand much higher than it used to be and much more sensitive to temperatures. But we haven't necessarily designed the way we maintain equipment and maintain generators and schedule generators off for maintenance and so forth with winter peaks in mind. This particular episode was so cold that the winter peak reached a level that is similar to normal summer peaks. So that was one thing that made it very unusual, but it was also an extended period of time. Another thing that's happened is, since 2011, we've had a big increase in wind generation in ERCOT, which is not controllable in the same way as thermal capacity. This has meant that we have to have a lot of standby capacity that you can use to back up wind and solar when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. We've sort of, in a sense, become more reliant on that backup capacity than before. The immediate issue was, if you look at power outages of the different generating equipment, the problem started around about February 10, with about 10 gigawatts of the wind generating capacity went offline because the wind turbines in Texas are not winterized. So further north, they spend extra money on the turbines to make them withstand cold weather, but the ones here were not like that. So if you have ice build up on the blades, they lose their aerodynamic properties. Further north, they have heaters in the blades and so on, so the ice doesn't build up. You also have problems with the icing of the gear assembly and so forth. So anyway, that was the initial problem. We lost about 10 gigawatts of wind. Over the next couple of days, there were various outages of different kinds of plants. In fact, every kind of generating capacity had problems. Eventually, we even had problems with the nuclear and a little bit with the hydro, or everything actually. A lot of the problems were the losses of capacity. They were fairly small. A lot of them were to do with water handling, water pumping and so forth. But the big problem we had was on the night of February 14, early hours of February 15, with this sort of gradual increase in outages and then the big increase in demand as the cold temperatures spread further south, particularly the major cities, started to run short. ERCOT has, as I mentioned, they have this ability to cut cut some customers off, which they did voluntarily, but that was not enough to bring the supply back into to match with demand. And so we had eventually what they call Energy Emergency Alert Level 3, where you cut off people involuntarily. So you have blackouts. And the idea was that these blackouts, they would do them to different parts of the state in sequence. The idea is people wouldn't be cut off for too long. This is when we had the fatal problem, because as soon as they had the Emergency EEA Level 3, which are the involuntary cut-offs, it turned out they cut off some gas compressors on the gas pipelines and the storage facilities. And so you had a reduction in natural gas generating capacity, and that's what backs up all the renewables in ERCOT, basically is the gas plant. So when you had a reduction in gas supply, that further reduced generation, which then led to more cuts and so on. And so you had a sort of an unstable feedback in a way. So we lost about 12 gigawatts of gas, and that's really when the problem hit. And then why did it last so long? The problem is once you start cutting off demand, it's a little while to fix up some of the problems. But the other thing is, as was mentioned, on the synchronous system, you have to keep demand in balance with supply all the time. As you bring customers back online, you have to have enough generating to exactly balance the demand as you bring it back. So it's not a simple matter of just turning things on. As you bring customers back online, you've got to bring the generation to balance. And so it takes a little while to recover. The two big chunks of loss was initially the wind and then the big chunk of gas. And then along the way, we also lost some of the coal plants had problems with water. The nuclear plant had problems actually with water again, the South Texas one. And the hydro, just about everything had problems. Yeah.
You talk about ERCOT and people who are making decisions to cut off various users. And a lot of us remember pre-deregulation days when Houston Lighting and Power was it. They did everything. Now they don't. So, Dr. Cohn, put on your historian hat for us. Give us a little political backstory. How did we end up with ERCOT? How did we end up with the system we have today? What was the politics behind all that?
Well, the backstory really extends back to the beginning of the 20th century when electrification took off in Texas as it did elsewhere in the country. At that time, Texas wasn't all that different from anywhere else. Public and private companies were lighting up streets, starting to light up buildings. The first interconnections were built not in Texas, California, some places in the east, in the mountains. And they were really intended to match up, say, a hydroelectric plant with a coal-fired plant. And it was a conservation move, which I find interesting. When the water was running high, you would use less coal. When the water was running low, you would have to run the coal more. So, people were trying to conserve coal. There was actually worry that they would run out during some moments in the early 20th century. And Texas power companies began to interconnect in the 1920s. Houston Lighting and Power was one of the first. And the reason Houston Lighting and Power chose to do it was because they had just built a great big new generating plant on the ship channel, and they needed more customers. They didn't have enough in their area. The first company they interconnected with was Gulf States Utilities, which operated in Texas and Louisiana. So right off the bat, early interconnections in Texas were actually into other states. But remember that at this time, there was very little regulation of these companies, and in fact, no federal regulation. Most states began regulating their power utilities by 1920. Texas waited till 1975. So in Texas, these utilities really had a lot of autonomy to make their decisions, to negotiate how much customers were going to pay with their local governments. No state regulation. The federal government stepped in 1935. Congress passed two laws that gave the Federal Power Commission authority to regulate interstate wholesale power transactions. And this was a moment when utilities everywhere, not just in Texas, but say Connecticut, Florida, other states, had to decide, do I stay in this interstate interconnection and take on whatever federal regulation requires, or do I say it's not worth it, I'm only going to operate within my state? So for companies like Houston Lighting and Power, by the time these laws had passed, they had built up a pretty good-sized customer base within Texas. They really didn't need those customers in East Texas and Louisiana anymore. They ended that relationship with Gulf states, and most of the other utilities not on the perimeter of the state did the same thing. They did have their ties within the state. And there were a few other anecdotes along along the way, particularly related to World War II, but I'm going to fast forward us to the 1970s. By this time, most of the big utilities in Texas had organized into what they then called the Texas Interconnected System. This was an intrastate network. They did share power. Most of the time it was really just for backup because they were all using the same fuel sources and their costs weren't that different from each other. And a few other things had changed by this time. There had been a really big blackout in 1965, as I mentioned before, and reliability was a top concern. So the utilities organized ERCOT in 1967. This is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. And they had done this to have a third party that would provide assistance with reliability standards and planning, not to operate anything. The legislature enacted the law that created the Public Utility Commission of Texas. So for the first time, Texas utilities were regulated in 1975. And the utilities then began to rely on ERCOT more for these reliability matters. But I wanted to bring this back to your initial question of our isolated grid. In the 1970s, as some of you may recall, we had some energy crises, and this particularly affected power companies that used natural gas, and there were some extreme differentials between the price of natural gas in Texas and in Oklahoma that the utilities contracted for. There were some Oklahoma utilities that wanted to get their power from Texas. So there was an event, a surreptitious wiring of the Texas grid to the Eastern interconnection called the Midnight Connection, and this threw everybody into a tizzy. Houston Lighting Power and another big utility pull out of the Texas grid. There were lawsuits that lasted into the 1980s, and the upshot was that the Texas utilities returned to the intrastate grid only and were permitted to build the direct current ties out of the state in order to share power across state lines under controlled circumstances. Studies that were conducted through those years indicated that there might have been some economic benefits to interstate interconnection, but they hadn't established that there would definitely be reliability benefits at that point.
To pick up on your question too, I mean, you're saying, why did we change this? I mean, it seemed like they were pretty good at keeping the lights on, so why did we change it? And I guess there's an international context for that we started to get what's called the electricity system reform movement. Started with Chile and the United Kingdom and various other countries that deregulated their power system, separated out generation from transmission from distribution. And why did they do that? Fundamentally, there were technological changes that enabled that. It couldn't have been done before. You need all the information technology and so forth. You need to be able to record how much power different entities are supplying all the time and do all the accounting and so forth, so you can pay them for the power they're supplying, charge people for the power they're drawing and so forth. Couldn't have been done before. So we're able to do it, but just because we're able to do it, that doesn't necessarily mean why you want to do it. The main motivation for doing it, particularly not in the United States where you had private utilities that were regulated, but a lot of these other countries, they were government-owned power companies and run very inefficiently. And there's a lot of evidence for that, a lot of studies showing that. And the argument was that we want to introduce competition to force them to lower their costs and so on. And so this was a way of doing that, was to introduce competition in the power system. And so it was done actually overseas earlier than the United States, but eventually here too. There have been a number of academic papers arguing that the regulated utilities in the United States also did not operate efficiently. In fact, the argument was that they had a tendency to overinvest in capital because there's a regulated rate of return on capital. So the argument was that there was too much gold plating and overinvestment. The deregulation movement also spread here. And of course, it's a tricky thing to do. Everyone knows about the California crisis. Pretty early on, it was one of the first states to deregulate. So it's not all one way in terms of only benefits and no costs.
So the two of you have shared a lot of information with us, but we're going to get to the final question. I'm going to let you go first, Dr. Hartley. Where are we today? What can we expect going forward if another Winter Storm Uri comes our way?
So the major problem, as I mentioned, that we identified, and you could argue this was a problem with our ERCOT planning in a way, was this connection between the gas system and the electricity system, and the fact that the gas compressors and the compressors on the storage facilities used to be run off the natural gas. So you'd use that natural gas to generate electricity and to run the compressors. They switched them to run off the ERCOT network, but the gas compressors were not designated as what's called critical facilities. You can have a facility drawing electricity within ERCOT designated as critical. So a typical example would be a hospital where you don't want the power cut off because people will die, right? so the hospital can apply to be a critical facility, so it's exempted from cut-offs. Well, what we should have done was designated all the gas compressors as critical facilities. The problem here was when they started cutting, they cut the gas compressors, you see. And so it was a 2-page form, basically, to fill in. And within 2 days of the Uri, a bunch of gas firms running the gas pipelines did put in the form, and their compressors have now been designated as critical facilities. So next time they won't be cut off, hopefully. When they go to cut off people, they should make sure that those circuits are not cut. So that's the biggest single failure, I would say, and the biggest single problem, and the easiest thing to correct, okay? And it was a bureaucratic snafu that these things were not designated as critical facilities in the first place, and a lack of communication between the pipeline system and the electricity system, and that's been improved. The second thing is a lot of the smaller outages and so on were to do with water pumps and things like that, and those things can be winterized at fairly low cost. That's been done. On the other hand, if you take like the wind turbines, that's very expensive to go back and retrofit and winterize all those. So no, I don't think that would be done, and I doubt that it would be economic to do it.
The legislature did take a number of steps to try to address the problems that occurred, several of which you've just described, some of which are to be determined because we haven't had the conditions that we had 2 years ago. So we don't really know if we've taken care of it. But the other thing to note is that right now the legislature is back in session, and I took a quick look. There were upward of 30 bills filed that in some way address the electric power system in Texas. So it's still very much front of mind for a lot of people. I even noted there was a bill filed in both the Senate and the House that had to do with interconnections with other states, so clearly at least 2 people are thinking about that. I think what remains to be seen is A, what changes will the legislature approve going forward this year? And B, will it be enough if we do have conditions like Uri or worse in the future? And we still don't know.
Well, Dr. Cohn, Dr. Hartley, thank you very much for being with us today. We can only hope that the legislators and others reach out and talk to people like you when they try to solve this problem going forward, because I know the average person on the street, we look at it and our eyes kind of wobble in our heads when we talk about the way the utilities are set up now and what makes them work. So this has been very helpful. We appreciate your being here today.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. This episode was produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. Planning support was provided by Laura Hotze, Karina Zemel, and Anissa Sanchez. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Many thanks to the Baker Institute production interns who assisted with this episode, Maya Atikari and Sarah Davidson. The Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based at Rice University in Houston, Texas. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening.